Let's have a round of applause for volunteers. All right. Going to ask the question. Are our two brave volunteers similar? Why are they similar?
They're women.
They're women. Okay. Any other reason why they're similar? They both got the memo as to how to dress. Okay. Approximately the same height.
They both have ID badge.
They're both wearing ID badges. They're both state employees.
They don't have no glasses.
They don't have glasses on, apparently. Okay. Well, there's no obvious glasses on, yes. They may have contact. They're taking this course, yes. Do you really know if they're similar? All you know is what you observe. So we're going to ask them to say whether they think they are similar, and if so, why.
We're similar because we both work in procurement and we work on procurement together. We both have daughters. We both have an older brother and an older sister. Relatives in Florida.
You heard that, relatives in Florida. These were all things that you could tell just by looking at them, right? They got to check their similarities.
That's pretty, we're both from Maryland. We both work at DHMH. That's pretty much it.
Both Maryland natives, both working in the same agency, same large agency. Okay, thank you. What's the purpose of our little exercise? Other than to make people feel ill at ease and put them on the spot. Similar, you have to have some standard or some definition as to what is similar. And sometimes what you think is similar actually is, and sometimes what you think is similar isn't, because you don't know what the standards are. And that's another thing I see all the time, and I always go back to agencies and say, all right, explain what you mean by similar. And usually after I tell them to identify what they mean by similar, then I say, okay, now remove the word similar and just say the vendor, offerers, bidders, etc. must meet the following. You don't have to use the word similar if you say what the characteristics are. So, and I always go through this. Okay, tell me what similar means to you. So they tell me, and then I say, okay, then put those in the document and take out the word similar so everyone knows that's what you want. So let me, sometimes, well, hopefully that conveyed it, because you had to kind of agonize, and you could see what you could see, but you didn't know if that's what they were going to say was the similarity or not similarity. They could have said they were like two peas in a pod, or as if they were from different planets, because they might have looked at aspects completely extraneous to what you could see physically. So you just have to think about that. What is similar? Yes?
Even in geometry, similarity of things meant that there are aspects, points that you define to be similar. Other than that, if you have similar triangles, they could be one. Could
Yeah,
be
I'm trying to think of.
One could be a little teeny one could be a gigantic, but they're similar if the angles were the same.
Back to trigonometry or something, algebra, something like that.
Geometry, yes, sir.
Oh, way too long ago to want to think about. What's the point of the exercise? You can't play the game if you don't know what the rules are, or if the rules are made up as you go along to suit someone else's purposes. Well, you just give me your bid or proposal, and I'll let you know after you give it whether you're similar, whether you're what I had in mind. So if you're a vendor, you're going to play that game? Vendors need to know in advance how an award will be made, whether their product, service, etc. will be judged to be similar. It costs money to submit a bid or proposal. If a vendor knows it won't be considered for an award, very often it won't bother to respond. It'll save their time, your time, by them not responding if they know in advance that they are going to be judged not to be what you are requesting. Or some other things might happen, like the clicker actually moving. Well, there it went 2. Did I go 2 or 1? All right, is that the next one? Vendors can challenge the agency's specifications. They can seek clarification or suggest changes, or, and this is not necessarily a desirable result, they can file a protest if they believe the specifications are unreasonably restrictive. Those 2 words that I mentioned a few minutes ago. It is generally better to confront a claim of unreasonably restrictive specifications before responses are due than to have to defend a decision after the fact. I want vendors to come to me and ask questions and point things out so I can address it while there's time to do something about it. I would rather deal with something ahead of time than after the fact, because I have more flexibility before the bids or proposals are due than I have afterwards. And if it's a bid, I have no flexibility afterwards. Which is essentially this: before there is leeway to make a change, beforehand there is leeway to make a change which may diffuse the issue with no harm to either side. The agency may not realize how restrictive a certain requirement is, or it may not be significant. You didn't know that you were saying something that really was going to cause vendors to charge more money or to not respond. You just thought it was a minor little detail. And until the vendor came to you and said, this is something that's a game changer, you didn't know that. And now that you know that, I don't really need that. That could be what your answer is. Or the agency may not want it once you understand what it means. Well, gee, I didn't know that was going to double the price just by asking for that little feature that I don't really even need. You don't know that unless vendors come to you. Going back to that situation at the airport with the taxi and the dispatching of all calls, if someone would have said simply to the Aviation Administration, do you really mean that no one can walk out of the airport terminal and get in the first cab? It's before they do that, they have to call somebody. Do you really mean that? The agency could have said, well, no, we don't mean that. And it would have saved, in that case, a protest, going before the Board of Public Works, the governor getting irritated and ordering them to redo it within 6 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever it was, all because no one asked the question. Knowing all this in advance allows the agency to make judgments about the need for the requirements or possible alternatives. As I said, after bids are opened, there is no ability to change. Bids are final. You open them at that time and place, time, date, etc., and they are on your specifications, and you cannot change anything after the bid has come in. You can find a vendor to be responsive or non-responsive. You can find them to be responsible or not responsible, but nothing can change of the specifications, and unless there is an error, an obvious error in the bid price, nothing can change in the bid price. So you have to live with what you said, or you have to do it over. Either you have to defend your requirements and risk further appeal and more delays and the possibility of having the requirement overturned, or a disgruntled vendor that may not bid again, or you uphold the protest and do the procurement over with revised requirements. You have no flexibility in a bid situation after the bids have been received and opened. So it's much better to find out in advance if there are problems where you can rectify it. It's much better to be able to. All right, is that the next one I didn't jump to? After proposals are received, there is greatly reduced ability to change requirements. Now, obviously, if you're talking about sealed proposals, it's not something where the award is based solely on price, but still, it is based upon your specifications in addition to price, and the price is based upon your specifications. So you have some ability to revise specifications after receipt of proposals but you do not have a wide ability. You have to make the determination that other vendors probably would not have responded if you would have had these different requirements at the time of the original solicitation. If you determine that vendors likely would have made no difference in who responded, then you can make a modification to the specifications after receipt of proposals. If you determine that it is very possible other vendors might have responded, you cannot make the change. You either live with what you have or you reject and do it over. It's always better to know in advance. At the very least, it will take more time to issue an addendum and maybe do a best and final offer. At worst, it will be determined that the change cannot be made without doing the procurement over, or the other alternatives mentioned previously, disgruntled vendors, the possibility of losing at the Board of Contract Appeals, all from the standpoint of you didn't say what you wanted. You didn't explain it. The moral, forewarned is forearmed. Forearmed. What is that? I don't know. It's a new word. I'll define it in the definition section. Pay me now, doing the work up front to get the specifications as appropriate as reasonably possible, or pay me later by risking protests, having to do the procurement over, paying higher prices than needed to reduce future competition. These are the aspects just because you didn't say what you wanted and explain it properly. All right, any questions before we go to a new topic? Starting to roll, right? Duration of the contract, contract term. Duration, start date, end date, renewals, run-out provisions. So this is where we're going next. Contract duration, generally, and I emphasize generally, state contracts can be for any duration of up to 5 years. Now, if you are doing something past a single fiscal year, you must make a determination, which I probably should include in the slides and didn't, that says that, I forget exactly what it says, something to the effect that you have to determine that the requirements are reasonably continuing into a one or more fiscal years, and there is, would be economies of scale to be derived by having a multi-year contract, and it is not disadvantageous to vendors to have a multi-year contract. So there's 3 or 4 things that you're supposed to determine are present before you supposedly can do a multi-year contract. And multi-year means over a single fiscal year. So it can be as finite as starting on June 30th and ending on July 1st of a 2-day period, but it's in 2 fiscal years. So it doesn't have to be more than 365 days. It just has to extend beyond 1 fiscal year and into another fiscal year, and then it is considered multi-year. All right, generally, the duration can include a base term plus 1 or more option terms, i.e. you can have a straight 5-year contract, a 4-year contract with a 1-year option, 3 years with 2 1-year options, 2 years with 3 1-year options, 1 year with 4 1-year options, etc. The old thing of no matter how you slice it or dice it, it can get up to 5 years. So that's the general rule. 5 years is the maximum duration. You can have other available ways to come to the 5 years. You can have it 3 years and a single 2-year option, or 1 year with 2 2-year options. You can see it's still various ways to get to the maximum of 5 years. Of course, contracts don't even have to run a full year. You can have them 6 months with a 6-month option. So you just base term and options are available to you. In extraordinary circumstances, contracts can run more than 5 years. So again, I said generally 5 years is the limit. If you have a reason why you think it is advantageous to the state to go beyond 5 years, then you will need to explain that, and you will need to get approval for the duration that you are requesting. And the most typical scenario when you're going beyond 5 years is if there is a large contract with very high startup costs and great complexity in transitioning from one vendor to another. So you want to do it as seldom as possible. You want to maximize the investment of the procurement and minimize the frequency where you have this transition, and so you may want more than 5 years. In such instances, there might be a 5-year base term and 1 or 2 one-year options or a single 2-year option, because typically, even though 5 years is the normal standard, the other standard, which is even much more strictly enforced, is 7 total years. Let's see, the longer an agency wants to have a contract run past 5 years, the more it will have to justify the requested duration. As a practical limitation, it is extremely rare for any contract to exceed 7 years, including the base term and any option terms. And I don't know if I've ever seen a contract with more than 5 years as the base term, like let's say a 6 or 7 year base term plus options. I don't think I've ever seen that. And something like that would be harder to justify than 5 years with 2 one-year options, for instance. In extremely rare instances, the outside duration might be 10 years. I have occasionally have myself approved 10-year contracts, but I can probably count on one hand the number of 10-year contracts I've approved in 30 years of doing procurements. They're rare. And the longest I've ever seen, not that I've approved, but the longest I've ever seen is 15 years, and that is because there was financing involved, and the particular ones I've seen are energy efficiency, where you have up to 15 years to amortize the investment in the energy projects. So normally 5 years with additional justification, maybe 7, and maybe 10, but you're going to have a hard fight to get anything beyond 7 or anything beyond 5. So any questions about that? A lot of people don't even know you can go 5 years or any of this stuff, so I've heard that. That's why I put this in here. Start and end dates. Simple stuff. Every contract has a start and end date. The start and end date typically are only subject to variability for discrete standalone projects. What that means is if you have something that you want, if you want a building built, that is something, the duration of the project is as long as it takes to build the building. So maybe you will say the building has to be started construction by a given date, but maybe there is variability that you can start it sooner, just as long as it isn't later. Maybe there's a great deal of variability in when it can be finished. We went through the incentive example with the Northridge earthquake, where the vendor had 140 days to complete the highway, and they completed it in 66 days. Obviously, they had variability to complete the project sooner than what might have been specified, or the finite date that was specified. So those are the types of procurements when you can have possible variability in start date and end date. When you do not have variability is when you have ongoing contracts that must be continuously performed, which many of you do have. If you have a food service contract at a facility, you got to have the food there. You can't have a 5-day gap between when one vendor ends a contract and when the next vendor begins a contract if you have residents there that have to be fed 3 times a day. So it has to be there. You need security, you need housekeeping, these types of things. You need continuous performance, and one contract has to lead into the other contract without a gap. If you can have a gap, then it's in the first situation. Example, residential treatment services, etc. Residents cannot be displaced between contractors. Food service, security, IT systems, etc. You can't have gaps. And we're getting into some issues here. If a successor contract isn't ready to assume a contract when the existing one is to end, the existing contract needs to be extended if the contractor is willing to do so. So if for some reason you haven't done your procurement, you have a protest, something like that, you cannot make the follow-up award, the first thing you're going to do, if you need the service, the activity, is go back to your incumbent and seek to extend. Of course, that's when you're going hat in hand and basically usually begging them, will you continue to do it? and they know they have the driver's seat position, so they usually come to you and say, yeah, I'll do it, but under these circumstances, etc. The second point up there is something that is kind of like a hypothetical or rhetorical type of question that I don't have an answer, and when I've discussed it with my lawyers, they haven't been able to give me a specific answer. And that's the question: if you want a vendor to continue a contract and they don't want to do it, can you compel them to continue? And under the change order clause, if it is construed to be within the scope of the contract, you can compel them to continue, but the ambiguity is what is within the scope of the contract. Do you have the right to order them to continue? And fortunately, we've never gotten to the point that I'm aware of that we've ever tested whether you do or don't have that right, because it very likely might be determined you don't. And so you don't want to be in the position of having to go hat in hand to a vendor to say, pretty please, will you continue? Will you continue if I give you more money, et cetera, et cetera. That isn't in the best interest of the state. Let's see. Extending a contract with a vendor. Stop me if you've heard these before. Well, don't stop me if you've heard them before. Just applaud or whatever. Can cause higher prices. How frequently have you ever had to pay a vendor more money for them to continue a contract? Because they say they don't want to continue it at the same price. Anyone ever had that? One brave soul, two brave souls. I've had it. And you try to coerce them in not doing it, but really they're in the driver's seat. Conflict with current contractors. There are times when you don't want to continue with that vendor. You were just waiting to get to the end of the contract so you could get rid of them. And here you are, you have to extend with them because. And sometimes the because is because they filed a protest, and the protest is causing you to continue with them. In that situation, you do have some leverage, because if they want more money, you can say, no, if you want me to continue with you, you're going to do it for the same price, or else I'm not going to extend with you. I'm going to deny the protest and seek award notwithstanding protest for the other vendor. So you do have some leverage if the incumbent is the one that's trying to hold you up. And we do have that discussed in the procure class with that type of scenario. Let's see, stress for contractor and agency personnel and affected clients. The other thing that you hear all the time from contractor and outgoing contractor is, my staff is leaving. They've heard we're not going to get the contract again, or they're uncertain what's going to happen. So they have their resumes out there, and people have already given me notice because of the uncertainty, they don't know whether they're going to still have a job here, so they're getting out while the getting's good. And it's making me, the incumbent contractor, more difficult to perform because of all this uncertainty. And if you're serving clients, the clients may know there's something going on, and they may be getting nervous of, well, am I going to lose the people that have been serving? Am I not going to lose the people serving me, etc.? It is a problematic situation which we try to avoid. Extending a contract is contrary to the principles of public procurement. Doesn't mean you can't do it, it just isn't what we're supposed to be about. None of this is a desired outcome, so the activities for procurement need to start in sufficient time to prevent these complications. Anybody argue with that? I didn't think so. Usually we have the unforeseen circumstances or the limitations of resources that prevent us from doing these, not because someone doesn't realize that they shouldn't be doing these things. Possible complications described under renewal options on sign 477. What number is this? 463. Also apply to contract start and end dates. All right, I'm going to describe this because I realize it's hard to read that, and if you read that, you still may not understand what it says. So I'm going to tell you what it says because I've had to go through this twice, which means I'm part of the problem if I have to do it twice. Very simply, one time 5 years ago and one time 5 months ago, or maybe even 3 months ago, had two situations that were similar in that procurements were done, the award was recommended for other than the incumbent, and the incumbent filed a protest. Well, in one it was the incumbent, and the other one it was not the incumbent. In the one situation, which was your pharmacy benefits services. So if any of you have catalysts for pharmacy benefits, the procurement that we did 5 years ago where we made the recommended award to Catalyst, Caremark had been the incumbent vendor for 12 years. Caremark filed a protest. And then they filed a second protest, a third protest, a fourth protest. It ended up with 2 hearings before the Board of Contract Appeals. And 11 months after our initial submission of an item to the Board of Public Works for approval of the award to Catalyst, we got the final decision on the second hearing from the Board of Contract Appeals, and all appeals by Caremark were denied. And so we were now at the point we could go forward and make an award to Catalyst. We had done a procurement for 5 years. And so we were drafting a contract to go to Catalyst that was going to be for 5 years from July 1st of that year through June 30th, 5 years later. And when we sent this to our lawyers for them to approve for legal sufficiency, they shocked us by saying, you can't have a 5-year contract now. And I said, what do you mean we can't have a 5-year contract? This was clearly bid as put out for procurement as a 5-year contract. And yes, we had anticipated starting this a year earlier, but because of the protest, we couldn't award, so now it's only fair if we go ahead and start the contract July 1st of this year for 5 years. And the lawyers say, well, it might be fair, but you can't do it. And I'm like, okay, explain this to me, because this is a new one on me. And what they said is, if you go to the price form, each of the 5 years had a discrete price form that was for that year and that year only. The first year of the contract, the first year pricing that they gave us was gone. Through the extension of the contract because of the protest, that period of time had elapsed. And what they said is, and now you only have prices for 4 discrete years. You don't have a price for the 5th year. So you cannot automatically extend the 4th year price into the 5th or whatever. Because you didn't ask for it, you cannot have that now as being part of your contract. And that upset me, because I had spent a year going through this protest and appeals, knowing we were right from the very beginning that this was all a waste of time and they were going to lose ultimately, which they did. But in the process, the vendor we recommended lost out on a year. And Caremark gained another year for their protest. So in that 1 year, they got, let me think now, we spend close to $300 million a year on pharmacy benefits. So that 1 year got them gross about 250, 270 million, and however much profit they made on that, they were very pleased with at least 1 more year. That same amount came off of our new vendor. Yes?
Didn't you ask the new vendor to affirm their pricing?
We asked them to affirm their pricing, but no one thought during this whole process that there was any issue with the duration. It was only after everything was over and we went to have the contract actually fill in the blanks with the years and things like that, that the lawyer said, wait a minute, we don't have a 5th-year price. Yes?
Well, I think, and you brought this up to us in your group, that
I did.
we should say contract year and not specific year. Had it said first contract year, second contract year, that would have avoided that problem. Versus 2006, 2007, 2000.
The answer we were given, and the answer that usually happens, we were our own worst enemy by the fact we asked prices discreetly by year and had no language that had any flexibility beyond those discrete time frames. I have a price for July 1, 2010 to June 30th, 2011, and that's all the price I have. And if I can't have the contractor work from July 1st, 2010 to June 30th, 2011, it's just gone. That has been the interpretation. So what we supposedly, since that time, have been doing is not boxing ourselves into that situation. I say supposedly because we had another situation where, with a protest that delayed an award for something like 15 months. And when we look back, we found out we had done the same thing again. We had a price that was discrete for a given period of time and could not be extrapolated into the future. So in that case, the vendor, what we had to go to the Board of Public Works was a 3-year and 7 or 8 month contract rather than a 5-year contract, because the whole duration of the protest came off of the vendor in terms of the new award. In that situation, it was the incumbent, so at least they were the one who continued for the whole 15 months during the protest and appeals, so they didn't lose it in a total contract standpoint, but the new contract was only for 3 years and some months. So I'm standing before you to tell you, don't do what I've done twice now. And like I say, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So hopefully it'll never happen again, but I'm warning you. Yes?
It doesn't seem fair, though, if I was the vendor, to be in a situation where I'm guaranteeing you 5 years of pricing without dates, it's 5 contract years, and my, no fault of my own, it's delayed 2 years in protests.
Oh, believe me.
You shouldn't be able to hold me to pricing that's 7 years out.
And that's kind of the logic of the lawyers, that they said we had no legal right, and even if the vendor wanted to be held to it, they said we couldn't do it. We had some discussion with our lawyers, but ultimately we do what we always do. We listen to our lawyers. But in that situation, what we're saying is you need to have language that even if you say it is anticipated a contract will start on a given date and run X number of years to another date, you should additionally have some contingency language in the event that the contract does not begin on such and such date. It shall run from 5 years from the actual start date and end 5 years afterwards. And then the other thing that you cannot do, even if you, in the narrative of the solicitation, describe the contract term, do not on the price form have specific discrete dates for the prices. It could be contract year 1, contract year 2, etc., so that the wording on the price form is consistent with the narrative language in the solicitation that says you will have a first year, a second year, a third year, which might be these dates or it might not be these dates. So that's what all this is supposed to say, both here and on slide 476. You don't want to have happen to you what has happened to me twice. Because I'm not smart. I don't know enough to do these things right, apparently. All right, let's see. Now we're starting specifically on start date. We're starting on start dates. Usually the agency specifies the exact or latest permissible start date in the solicitation. So again, you have 2 variations right there. Latest, the exact start date, or the latest permissible. If you have a situation where you can simply say you must start by X date, you can do it sooner but not later, or got to be this date as of 12:01 a.m. or 9 a.m. or whatever, you will say what you want in your specifications. Depending upon the circumstance, you might allow vendors to say when they can start the contract. It's not highly likely if it's a sealed bid that you will give them that option, but it is very likely in sealed proposal that you can have them identify the start date, and you can have that as an evaluation criteria. There may be some circumstances where you can do it in sealed bid also, but you have to have a mechanism for equating prices then. Excuse me, which there can be, and I think in the pricing class we tell you how you can do it, but it's more likely for sealed proposals. Let's see, in a straight bid, this can only be considered as part of bid responsiveness or bidder responsibility. In a multi-step sealed bid, this can be part of the determination of whether a bidder's offer is acceptable, and it can be an evaluation factor in a sealed proposal procurement. Generally, this is something that you're going to hear from me. It may be the first time you've heard this, but this is a general recommendation. It's nice to begin contracts on the first day of a month. Many people think that if their contract right now ends on October 19th, that they must start a new contract on October 20th and have it run to October 19th. What we're going to say is, no, you don't. When you're structuring your procurement, if for some reason you have to start, let's say, on the 19th or the 20th, you don't have to end 1 year later. You can have it end 1 year and 10 days later, so that you get on a monthly cycle. It's easier for everyone to do things on the first of the month. And this is going to sound probably a little improbable, but we have agencies that come to us with retroactive items for approval because everyone forgot that their contract ended on the 19th and not the 30th or 31st. So they thought they had enough time to exercise the renewal because they thought they only had to do it as of the first of the month when, gee, we forgot it ended sooner than the first of the month or the end of the month. And even though it seems like you should know your start and end dates, people don't. Particularly if you've had turnover in the contract manager and if you don't have a good contract compliance checklist and various other things. I see it happening way too many times. So just try to get it on an even monthly cycle. Even if initially that can't be done, establish terms so this will happen within the term of the contract. It is not necessary to have a contract run exactly 1 year or exact multiples of years. Example, have the initial contract period end on the last day of the month so that then from then on a contract period will be on a monthly basis. Example, if a contract has started on the 12th day of a month for some reason, if the contract is multi-year, the end of the first contract period, and I don't say the first year, I say the first contract period. You use the word period, not year, can be set as either the end of the 11th month, which means it's roughly an 11 1/2 first period, contract period, or it can be at the end of the 12th month, which means it could be 12 1/2 months for the first contract period. So just that simple. You had the 12th and just either ended on the 30th of the preceding month or the 30th of the current month so that you get back on that even monthly cycle. Thereafter, all periods of the contract can be exactly 1 year in duration starting on the first day of the month. Simple. And we've been saying this for 10 years and still a lot of people have never heard that this is a good thing to do. Not a game changer. We're not going to reject it if it isn't on a monthly basis. We will just suggest to you it might be easier if you arrange it so that it will happen that way. Let's see. Contract might start when the agency issues a notice to proceed. So you would not give an exact start date. You say the start date will be contained in a notice to proceed. A notice to proceed is a written document that could be sent by email, by hard copy, etc., that goes to the vendor and says, this is the start date. And because this is the start date, here is the end date. Either a finite end date or ends when a particular circumstance has occurred, when the building has been built, something like that. Agency might give a range of dates within which the contract will start, but the exact start date will be specified in a notice to proceed. So the contract can start anytime between this date and this date. And the exact date when it will start will be in the notice to proceed. These are options you have. The issuance of the notice to proceed might be predicated on the contractor providing evidence that it is ready, willing, and able to start the work. So the vendor wins the contract, you go into a contract initiation conference, you have the vendor tell you the steps they're taking to perform, and you determine that you don't think they are applying enough effort, so you don't want to start the contract. If you have some flexibility here, when it otherwise might have, because you want the vendor to marshal their forces, get their resources together before you give them the go-ahead to start. You want them to perform from the first day as if they are capable of doing everything, and not start with less than full performance and hopefully will work their way up to actually doing what you want in some period of time. So a little further on this and what it means to a vendor if you predicate the start date on the notice to proceed and you have the flexibility. If you have the indication that the vendor is not properly preparing to start and you don't issue the notice to proceed, in some way often it's going to cost them money, because that means more time before they start making money off their investment to this point, and time is money, so they want to get started. So if you hold up the start date, you're putting pressure on them to do what's necessary to start properly, so hopefully they will do it. Also, you might have specified, so that's the first two bullets at the bottom there, and perhaps you specified damages if work does not commence by a given date due to contractor deficiencies. The damages, did we discuss it earlier, or is that coming yet?
The damages can't exceed the actual cost to the vendor or whatever. It can't be punitive, it has to be.
Right. We discussed it to some degree, but I still think we're going to discuss it more later if we stay around past 5 days. Let's see. All state contracts, this is something I'm going to tell you. This is a practical limitation. All state contracts cannot start and end on a fiscal year basis. It is a practical impossibility. That I know everybody, in particular the accounting people, they always want everything to be on a fiscal year basis. So if it's up to the accounting people, everything will start July 1st and end on June 30th, because it's easy for them to do accounting, end of the year accounting, etc., on a fiscal year basis. But guess what? If we have thousands of contracts in the state, all ending on the same day, and new contracts all starting on the same day, there are not the resources in the state to process all those contracts simultaneously. And even if we could, that would mean the other 9-10 months of the year would be sitting around doing nothing, because now they're not on the fiscal year basis. So even if people tried to do on a fiscal year basis, because of the log jam, the bottleneck that always happens when you have too many things going on at the same time, inevitably contracts start being stretched out. We start having extensions of the current contracts because we haven't been able to get to doing a re-procurement again, and so they work themselves out on a staggered basis anyway. So the best thing to do is to deliberately try to stagger start and end dates so that you have a relatively stable workload throughout the year and you can use your resources more efficiently. So I think that's basically what that says. Excessive time helps create excessive time frames discussed in overview. It's one of the reasons procurements take so long, because you're trying to do too many at the same time. And none of you, I think, is able to be cloned yet, so you cannot just make 1 or 2 clones and do more work simultaneously. Let's see, so contract end dates. Is that the next slide, or did I jump again? Next slide? Okay. So we gave you some rules of start dates, now we're going to give you some rules of end dates. Usually the agency specifies the exact or latest end or completion date in the solicitation. It's either going to end on this date or upon no later than something of that nature. Or vendors may be required to specify when they can complete the contract, especially again in the sealed proposal procurement. In multi-step bid, this can be part of the determination of whether a bidder's offer is acceptable. In a straight bid, this can only be considered as part of the responsiveness or bidder responsibility determination, the completion date. You can't give them more favorability because they're going to do something sooner unless you had a mechanism to allow that to be an aspect of pricing as per the pricing class. And again, it can be a valuation factor in sealed proposals. A contract corollary to what we said a few slides ago should end on the last day of a month, just as a nicety. End date can also be predicated upon achieving some condition, reaching a not to exceed amount. And not surprisingly, a not to exceed amount means an amount that is not to be exceeded. It doesn't mean it's just kind of like a target and, well, if we go beyond it, gee, so what? It is to be a finite amount that is not to be exceeded without another modification to raise the not to exceed amount. And what it means is unless you increase a not to exceed amount with approvals, once the not to exceed amount is reached, work is to stop. You're not supposed to keep going and incur more expense beyond the not to exceed amount. You either change it or that's the end of the contract when you've gotten to the maximum amount of money you're allowed to spend. That's what not to exceed means. And in the Perform class, we have a couple examples that when we go over them, I hope you will cringe. I hope you will.
If you have a not to exceed where the end date is 6 months later than when you've gotten to the not to exceed amount, and 2 or 3 months down the road, you decide to add money to the contract, do you have a retro?
All right. I'm going to restate this to see if I understand. You have a contract that has two aspects to it. You have a not to exceed amount, and you have a identified end date of the contract. And before you get to the identified end date, you get to the not to exceed amount. And then what you said is despite getting to the not to exceed amount,
There's a decision for additional work that's made 2 months later.
well, what has been happening at the time the not to exceed amount has been reached?
All clients were served. There are new clients that have come along.
So there's additional work, or there's been no work for like 2 months?
Additional work. Additional work.
So in other words,
But hasn't been identified for 2 months.
the vendor just kept doing what they were doing without anybody saying...
The vendor finished.
The vendor finished. All right, so they had a discrete project. They reached their not to exceed amount. And your question is the contract now over, or is it basically in suspension? And that kind of depends on the wording in your solicitation. And it depends on what you're doing. Can it be something that you really can have no work issued until and unless there is more money appropriated? And depending on your circumstance, you can have that. You can have, here's the finite duration, but during this time, we only have a certain amount to spend, and once we get to that for completion of whatever that buys, that we have the ability potentially to authorize, get more money authorized, then we can keep going. If it's specified that way, you can do it. What frequently, I don't know if I can use the word frequently, for me it happens way too frequently, but what sometimes happens is you have a not to exceed amount, but nobody pays any attention to it. The vendor doesn't pay any attention to it. They keep working even though they know they've already billed for that amount of money. The agency doesn't say stop, and what might happen is the agency realizes they have passed the not to exceed amount, so they stop processing the bills because it isn't really exceeding the contract amount if you don't pay the bills. You're just, we're less collecting IOUs. So that's okay, right? No, that's not okay. You are creating an obligation for the state beyond the authorized expenditure. The state can repudiate that commitment to a vendor. The state is not obligated to pay the vendor once that not to exceed amount has occurred. I don't think it has ever happened. Well, I do know one instance when it did happen, based upon a legislative audit and a Board of Contract Appeals decision. But typically what happens is you go to the Board of Public Works for retroactive approval of what you have already done, because the Board of Public Works knows they have two choices: not approve it and make a vendor very unhappy and have the vendor screaming and going to the legislators and saying the nasty state won't pay me what they owe me, or the Board of Public Works approves it, chastises the agency, because that's a preferable solution than to tell a vendor they're not going to get paid and whatever ramifications that has to the vendor. So it's not a good scenario, but that's the more typical situation where you just keep working and accumulating bills and come in after the fact for retroactive approval, which means you are into what's called a voidable contract, and you try to avoid that. You had a question.
If it's preferred we don't use the fiscal year contract start and end dates, is there also a problem using calendar year start year and end dates?
There is not. The question is there as much of a problem on a calendar year as a fiscal year? No. Believe me, there's probably 60, 70% that are done on a fiscal year basis, so calendar year basis is not a problem. There are some considerations like Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, etc., that makes it more difficult to have things done by that time, but it's not the same problem as fiscal year. Let's see. End date, achieving some condition, reaching a not to exceed amount, satisfying all deliverables. If, going back to our example of rebuilding the bridges after the North Ridge earthquake, once the bridges were rebuilt with inspection to make sure that it met the quality standards, the contract was done when they finished all the bridges. So even though they had 140 days they could have done it, they finished in 66. So the contract is over once all the bridges are rebuilt to the necessary standards. I, the vendor, give you my invoice. You pay me my, what was it, 14.8 million in incentive payments plus the couple million for doing the work, and I go away happy, and hopefully you, the commuters, are happy also. So that's another thing that you can have as when the end date is going to be achieved. Usually there's a maximum time frame the contract can run. All deliverables have to be done within that time frame. There's variability, but you give the finite, it cannot be later than this. So sooner, but not later. And the issue of incentives if you want to encourage sooner than later. Anyone ever heard of a run-out position? Well, let me ask, are there any questions on end dates, start dates, or end dates? All right. Anyone ever heard of a run-out provision? Anybody ever hear? Not you. You don't count. See, I always have ringers in the audience.
Is that anybody?
Well, then, have I defined what a body is? Are you anybody? I won't go there. Refocus. Anyone ever heard of a warranty? What is a warranty? What is a warranty?
Guarantee,
Guarantee that
whatever they say is, that will be provided, will be provided.
something's going to work as it was intended to work for a given period of time. Now that time usually is after it's paid for, right? But supposedly there is a provision that if something goes wrong during the warranty period, the vendor will, for no additional money, come back and fix it. Even though it is not identified as a run-out provision, that's what it is. A run-out provision is a requirement that lives beyond the supposed end date of the contract. Let's see. Circumstances when aspects of performance run past the stated contract duration. This has to be identified in the contract. For instance, the example I gave a couple days ago about the incentive for the drug treatment program, that if the vendor had to keep track of recidivism for 2 years with the potential of getting an incentive payment, the run-out provision was that they had to keep track for 2 years before they were potentially eligible for incentive. So the contract was over, their actual performance of the drug treatment was over, but there's something else they had to do for 2 years to see whether they were eligible for more money in that instance. let's see, say that for these circumstances the contract is still in effect, i.e. the term is extended by these circumstances but only within the context of these circumstances. No new work can be given during this period of extended performance, but the contractor's responsibility to perform does not end until these extended provisions are satisfied. And I said the recidivism example, and I think we give you more here. Is that the next one, or did I go 2 again? That's the next one. Examples: the need for vendors to testify at administrative or legal proceedings about his performance under a contract. Some of you have done contracts where that's the situation. If you have auditors, or you have appraisers, or you have somebody that does something that might end up with a lawsuit, the lawsuit may come after the contract ends, because usually you can file lawsuits 2-3 years later after something occurs. It might be after a contract's over. But if the state has to defend, you want the person who made the original determination or the original work that you based your decision on to be the one to go and testify to defend their work. So you can have a run-out provision for this. Another example, appear before legislative committees for up to 6 months after a final consulting report. That if you have a consultant that does an analysis and gives you recommendations, and you want to implement those recommendations, and you want to convince the legislature to either change laws, change regulations, appropriate money, whatever, you may want the contractor to come and testify before a legislative committee to convince them that they should go along with what is in the report and the recommendation you've made to them. You want the vendor to be the one that's there defending their rationale, answering questions, because you figure they should be better at it than you are, because you're taking the recommendation of this vendor who did the analysis. And they should have more insight and more knowledge than you do. So you want them there. Defendants audit work for up to 2 years after the contract end date if an administrative appeal is filed by an affected third party. The one that I remember a fair amount was the nursing home appraisals, where nursing homes could seek additional rates months after a contract was over, and we wanted the vendor that did the appraisal to come and defend their work. So these are run-out provisions. It's saying the vendor has to come back and do these things if these circumstances occur. Now the question of, do you pay? Oh, this is more examples. The need to pay claims that were incurred but not submitted during the contract period. All our medical contracts, the medical contracts, the pharmacy contracts, the dental contracts, the mental health contracts, we all have run-out provisions that the vendor has to pay claims. I think we give them up to 90 days. Does that sound right, Joy, 90 days?
Yes, for flexible spending. I don't know about
All right. I think we say for 90 days that because doctors and hospitals, it may seem strange, but they're notoriously slow in billing. And so we say if a claim was incurred during the period that a vendor was responsible for performing a contract, they have to, for up to 90 days, accept any claim that comes in based upon an activity that happened during the contract period. And so that's a run-out provision. More than 90 days, or whatever period we state, they don't have to do it, and in particular we say, don't bill us. In other words, if claims are not in within 90 days, you tell the doctors, the hospitals to forget it, because unless you, the vendor, want to pay out of the goodness of your heart, we're not going to pay you. And so whatever you do with the vendor that submits to you, that's between you and them. But 90 days is our cutoff. Or 4 months, as per the slide up there, but I think it's 90. Warranty or maintenance requirements, we've talked about that. The retention of, this is another continuing requirement, the retention of and continuing access to patient case or other specialized records. We have a clause that says they have to retain records for 3 years after the end date of the contract. That's a standard clause. So they are supposed to do that. And for those 3 years, if we go back to them, if our auditors go back to them and want to see those records to validate what they have charged, etc., they are supposed to have those records. It's a run-out provision. And we talked about the 2 years for the incentive situation. So you don't think of these as run-out provisions, but that's what they are. And the other thing you get into is whether you can pay for run-out provisions. And that's another thing you should specifically identify in the contract, whether you're going to pay for these things or whether they're supposed to be within the price the vendor charged you for the other work. And it can be either way, depends on the circumstances. And in the pricing class, we go into how to do it both ways and when it makes sense to do it one way versus the other. You're not going to pay a vendor to retain records. That's just something that it should not cost them any money. They should just make sure they do it. But something like paying claims, we actually allow them to quote us a price for what it's going to cost them to continue to pay claims for 90 days after the contract, and we will pay them that price after the 90 days after they've submitted their final claim. So in the contract, we have the requirement for them to do it, and we have them bid to an amount of what it costs for the run out, and we can pay them because by having it in the contract, that specific aspect of the contract continues for that duration. So you need to think about these things and identify them. Any questions on run out?
I'm reading this, it must be at the unilateral opinion of the state.
We're in renewal options, so you want to,
All right.
a question on renewal option now. So no questions on run out, or you have a question on run out?
No.
All right, so now we're going to renewal. So before we go to renewal, you have a question.
I just don't quite understand, renewals cannot be by mutual agreement of the parties?
Renewals cannot, may not, shall not, will not, must not. What other words can I think of? Be by mutual agreement of the parties. A vendor is not permitted to have a say in whether you will or will not exercise a renewal option, because renewal is defined in Title 21, and it is defined as the unilateral option of the state. And you cannot agree to give up that unilateral right. You do not have the legal right to give up that right. And I will have instances in Procure when we have determined that a renewal option did not exist because an agency did not structure it correctly, so that when they went to exercise it, it's, oh, you think you have a renewal option, but you don't, because it did not meet the definition that we're going to explain here. So, all right, renewal options must be specified in the solicitation to be valid under state law. Must be at the unilateral option of the state. Renewals cannot be by mutual agreement of the parties. Contractors do not have the right to decline a renewal option or force the state to renew if the state doesn't want to. And I have seen a protest just about 7 days ago when a vendor protested because an agency did not pick up a renewal option. And the bottom line, the answer to them is, go away. You have no right, forget it. That's what unilateral means. I have the choice, you don't. And you cannot agree to anything other than that simple statement, I have the right, you don't.
But if the state wants to exercise the renewal option, the vendor does not have say. The vendor has to.
Contractors do not have the right to decline a renewal option.
Locked in.
And there are times they will come to you. And I have one example, I have a number of examples in the perform class, when vendors have not wanted an option to be picked up. I'm losing money. I can't get staff. You don't want to renew this because I don't want to do it. And if you are tired of fighting and don't want to press the issue, maybe you don't exercise the option, but just because a vendor doesn't want it to happen, many instances means it's in the best interest of the state for you to exercise it. If they're losing money, that means you're making out like a bandit.
So that's the dogma.
That's what?
I have
stand up for the vendor community here, Joel. If they're legitimately not making money, and I'm not saying that they're griping that they're not making money, because many times vendors will do that and lie, but if they are legitimately not making money, you don't want a vendor who is financially irresponsible or financially unable to continue your contract, and you're forcing him deeper and deeper into debt. That, to me, isn't good business. But you do have to determine whether he's lying to you or not, because the opposite could be true. The vendor could want to cancel the contract only because rates in that particular industry have gone up substantially, and he's looking for a rebid opportunity. So you have to be careful on both sides.
All right. Now, the point counterpoint. What you will look at and try to determine is the financial viability of the vendor in question. And Gary is totally correct. If you have a vendor that is losing money, and if you exercise this option, they're basically going to go out of business, or they're scraping and they're going to give you just nothing but marginal performance because they just don't have the financial resources, you do not want to exercise that option. You don't want to put them or you in that situation. Conversely, if it's IBM, I was going to say General Motors, but I guess I shouldn't. Oracle, Microsoft, if they're the one that says they're losing money, you know there's no way they're going to go out of business. There's no way they will be able to repudiate and say, I'm going to go bankrupt. So someone with that, with the deep pockets, I would say, yes, you exercise the renewal option. So you need to look. You have the right to exercise it regardless, but the element of prudence does come into play. Just like I mentioned for the Department of Human Resources for that job placement, they even terminated contracts rather than try to force the vendors to comply because they knew the vendors were going to go out of business. So they did something that you wouldn't normally do, especially if it is a vendor with deep pockets that their loss is our gain because we're making out with it. But this is what the state has the right to do once we identify renewal options in the specifications. Let's see. Must be discrete. It must be stated when they will start and end, either by dates, description, or both. i.e. the renewal option 1 will commence immediately upon the expiration of the base contract period and will be for a duration of 1 year. This is illustrative language of how you can identify the term duration of a renewal option. Renewal option 2 will commence immediately upon the expiration of the first contract renewal period and will be for a duration of 1 year. So you haven't said July 1, May 1st, anything like that, but you have stated the condition that will happen and the duration of the option. That is sufficient option language. And you will have defined what the first base contract period is in your solicitation. Establish the term of the option period by dates or description or both, i.e. renewal option 1, again this is illustrative language. Renewal option 1 is expected to commence on October 1st, 2013 and run for 1 year until September 30th, 2014. However, if the base contract term does not begin on October 1, 2010 as anticipated, such as the 3-year contract base term does not end on September 30th, 2013, the first renewal option will make me unable to talk. Will commence immediately upon the expiration of the base contract period, whenever that might be, and will be for a duration of 1 year. So that's how you can couch it in terms that still makes it a viable option. Even though you've given what you think it's going to be from the date standpoint, but you've also given yourself the leeway that if things don't work out, you still have the ability to exercise the option within these circumstances. Establish the term of the option period by dates or description or both, i.e. there have been situations, and this is what I've already described. There have been situations when if an option term is defined solely by discrete dates and for some reason such as a protracted protest, these dates are not met, that the option is construed to be forfeited. If you say you have the right to exercise the option will start on July 1. And even if you extend the base contract term so that it runs past July 1, that does not automatically mean your renewal option is extended to when you have had when the extended base term ends. Maybe I should say that again because I tripped a little bit. Let's say you had a contract that was supposed to end June 30th of 2010 with a first renewal option to start July 1, 2010. Because of a protest, you extended the base term from the ending date of June 30, 2010 to, let's say, September 30, 2010. If you did not also, at the same time as you did the modification to extend the base term to September 30th, say, and by the way, the renewal option is extended from starting on July 1st to starting on October 1st, then it can be interpreted that because you did not exercise the renewal option on July 1st, it is no longer there to be exercised. You have to be careful of the words. It's the two-edged sword. Sometimes you can be so specific that if something other than the specific circumstances happens, you find yourself precluded from doing what you wanted. So you try to have some flexibility so that you get what you want even if circumstances change.
In that scenario, if you didn't push it till October, then technically you lose about 3 months.
If in that situation you didn't exercise the renewal option, then you've lost 9 months.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Because now you do not have the renewal option to exercise. Whereas if you simultaneously, when you negotiated the modification to extend the base term, said, oh, and the available one-year renewal option will be changed to begin October 1 and go to September 30th, or you could have said, you could have modified it to start on October 1 and still end June 30th of the next year. But you need to address that, or you can find yourself not having a renewal option you thought you had. Let's see. Yeah, it doesn't automatically move the start date if you had it discrete. That's what I said. At least I'll say that's what I said. Let's see. All applicable terms and conditions, including price, must be spelled out in the initial solicitation or contract. You must have a price for what the vendor is going to charge you or allowed to charge you during a renewal option. If you do not have a price, you do not have a renewal option. A renewal is not to have any significant term negotiated after the award of the contract. It must be established before you make an award, or you don't have a renewal option to begin with. It is not valid. No negotiation is permitted of anything significant, and price is significant. So you can't just say, I reserve the right to have a one-year renewal option, and you can say all the words about when it's going to start, when it's going to end, and have all the flexibility. But if you didn't have nailed down before the award what price will be paid during that renewal option, you cannot exercise it because it didn't meet the definition of a renewal option. And that happens more often than you think. And the examples are in the Perform class. I keep giving you advertisements to come to Perform. Let's see. This is what the vendor is providing a price to do at the time of the procurement. This should be factored into the award decision, i.e. typically an award decision should include the total of the price for the base term of the contract and option prices. I say typically. This is not a hard and fast rule. You will not see this addressed in Title 21. It is just a general recommendation that in most instances it makes sense to include the value of the renewal option, because probably 98% of the time we exercise renewal options. Vendors know that. Vendors count on you exercising the option. So if you don't work it into the award determination, you're giving them leeway to basically quote whatever they want for the renewal price. It is not going to be held against them at the award stage. And then when you're in the contract, you're usually going to do almost anything rather than do a procurement sooner than you have to. So you're going to exercise the renewal option. You might as well have it up front in the award determination what the price will be. That's my spiel. Let's see. Nothing substantive is to be negotiated at the time of renewal is exercised in terms of price or what is to be done for the price. And now with another comment.
Well,
I saw him stand up.
I thought you were going to comment on it.
Well, I don't know what you're going to say.
We are under the obligation to ask, and I'll put that in quotes, a vendor at the time we possibly seek to exercise his option, if he would voluntarily reduce his pricing. So there's a lot of words there, and in effect, it's strong-arming the vendor as much as we legally can do to have them reduce their price for the option, under the theory that if he doesn't want to reduce his price, and we believe we're in an area of economic conditions such as pricing in the marketplace truly is lower, then we will not exercise the option unless his pricing came down to a level that we believe is market price. So it's sort of, I don't think it violates what Joel's saying, but it does need to be added as a comment.
We might still have it up here. If we don't, I will amplify in about 7 minutes. Let's see. There have been improperly constructed renewal options that contained a finite price for the option period but said nothing about what was to be done for that price. So I've had the opposite of, yes, we have the term of the renewal but no price. I've also seen circumstances where we've had a price but nothing said what the vendor was supposed to do for that price. So that gets you to the same point. You don't have an option, because if you don't know what the vendor is supposed to do for a price, you have to go to them and you have to negotiate what they're going to do, and you're not supposed to negotiate any substantive aspect after an award date. So you don't have a renewal option even though you thought you did. Continuing on that theme, how a vendor can quote a price for something that isn't specific defies logic, but it has happened. And in the perform class, I give an example of a contract at Department of Human Resources from, I think it was Accenture, big vendor, when they quoted $300 and some thousand for a renewal option. And DHR came in with a modification for that contract for a period of time beyond the base term. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you have a renewal option and you have a price for that renewal option. And when we got to the fact that there was a price, but there was not one word in either the RFP or the vendor's proposal about what they were going to do for that $300 and some thousand. So we don't know if we were paying them $300,000 for one meeting, for 1 million meetings. You don't know. And because of that, it wasn't a renewal option. Let's see, the end result was the options weren't valid, but the agency was in that situation where there was at least language that anticipated an option, even if you ultimately couldn't exercise it. We have usually allowed that as justification for a sole source contract in some circumstances to basically get to the same point, but it's not an option. It's called something different. And maybe we will, maybe we won't. But let's see. Because in that situation there was no time to do a procurement once it was determined the option wasn't valid. But in the one this is talking about, there were renewal options beyond the renewal option, and even though we did a sole source contract for the first period of time, there was no right beyond that. They had to go out and do a procurement sooner than they anticipated. You got to structure them properly. Let's see, it is not recommended that a minimum time frame be specified for an agency to exercise an option. In the past, I used to say, we will give you at least 30 days notice, 60 days notice, etc. if we intend to exercise the renewal option. And again, another thing that happened all too frequently was that 25 days before the contract is due to expire, someone realizes they were supposed to have given 30 days notice. Guess what? The option has now expired. You did not do what your contract said you would do to exercise the option. It is no longer there. Even if both parties want to say, nope, we're going to ignore that, we want to exercise it, it is no longer there. It has expired. If you don't give such a upfront notification, you have the right to exercise up to the stroke of midnight on the last day, theoretically, and still have it be valid. So that's why our general recommendation is do not put minimum required timeframes for renewals. It usually comes back to haunt you. It is advisable to give vendors as much notice as possible you're going to exercise, but you don't want to lock yourself in that if you don't, the option has expired. When exercising renewal option, the renewal must be certain. The renewal must occur before the option expires. Let me just, the renewal must occur before the option expires. If it doesn't, it's gone. Let me see, how many more slides do I have? 2 more slides, then we disappear. So let me cover those 2 slides and then you can go to lunch. The required notice, and what this is doing is getting back to this point. The renewal must be certain. Required notice must be unequivocally given before the option expires. There cannot just be a letter, etc., that says that we're thinking about it, or we're probably going to do it, or if you do something, we're going to exercise it. I.e., the renewal is under consideration, the renewal will be exercised once required approvals are obtained, or the renewal will only be exercised if the contractor does or assures something first. The letter must provide absolute final notice before the option expires that the renewal is being exercised. If it doesn't, you did not properly exercise the renewal, and you cannot give such notice unless you have the authorization to give such notice. If you have to go to DBM or the Board of Public Works before having the authority and you don't do it, you can't give the notice because you don't have the authority to give the notice. You need to get things done on time.
That doesn't seem to be in the interest of the state. Say, for example, it's 30 days coming up before the option to renew.
Yeah?
And you go to the vendor and say that you want to exercise that option, but you have to go through the contract approval to do that.
Yeah?
I mean, now you're backing it up 90 days to go to the board.
Well, first of all, you shouldn't have something in there that says we have to give you X number of days notice. If you do, you need to go and get the approval in sufficient time that you can give that notice. If you don't, you didn't have the authority to give the notice. And if you just said, I'm going to renew this option, I'll give you the renewal letter once I get approval, and if you get the approval after the expiration date of the option, and you have not unequivocally exercised the option, it is expired.
Because it seems like the state has allowed in the past letters of intent.
And maybe in the past that was okay, but since a 2008 court case,
Really? Holy cow.
in this slide, and this is why I'm giving you some of these finite rules, i.e. a preliminary notice before the option expires is no good if the absolute notice is only given after the option expiration date. In a 2008 court case involving Baltimore County, it was ruled that a renewal option had expired when all the notices before the renewal expiration were that no final decision had been made whether to exercise the renewal. So in this situation, Baltimore County wrote the vendor and said, in so many words, we're still thinking about it. We're probably going to do it, but we're still thinking about it. And then 6 days after the expiration, Baltimore County, the procurement officer, sent a letter saying, we're exercising the renewal option. And in this situation, the vendor said, it's over with. we don't want to continue, we're losing money, you didn't exercise it, and it's over. And the county said, nope, we gave you notice, we intended to do it. You were on constructive notice that we were going to exercise. And the vendor took them to Baltimore County Circuit Court, and the ruling of the court was that since the county had not given a definite, unequivocal notice that they were going to renew, the option expired, and they could not enforce it after the fact. And there are only a handful of court decisions in the state on this issue, and none of them involve the state. In fact, there's only 2 of them that our lawyers have told us they could even find. One was this one, and another one was one from around 20 years ago with Baltimore City. And because those are the only 2 court decisions on record, and both of them have had a consistent interpretation, they are used as the precedent of what will govern for state law, since courts will look what other courts have made rulings of. And all right, go to lunch, come back about 3 after 1. I will pick up a little bit more on what Gary said about negotiating, and we'll try to load the other slides.